Hello, everybody. My name is Isabella Kaminska. I'm the Senior Finance Editor at Politico, and I want to welcome everybody here online and also, very nicely, in real life. Nice crowd, very good to see real people in the audience. So we're here to discuss how Europe can leverage foreign investment to meet its EU digital and green goals, and also whether governments and the financial sector are supporting the right industries. We're going to have a very broad discussion, and I'm very delighted to have with me three incredibly expert names, one of which is going to be joining us a little bit later at 11 via video stream, so just beware that is going to be your cookies, who is the State Secretary for Financial Market Policy and European Policy at the Federal Ministry of Finance in Germany. But with me in real life, as the young people say, is Lucas Aranguena. Sorry for the mispronunciation. Please join me here next to me. He is Group Head of Green Finance. He's Group Head of Green Finance and Global Head of ESG and Sustainable Tech at Santander. But also, I would like to welcome Martin Spolz. He is the Head of Sustainable Finance Unit at the Directorate General for Financial Stability, Financial Services and Capital Markets Union at the European Commission. So, say thank you. Let's welcome them. And just a quick reminder, if anyone in the audience has any questions, we're using the swap card system. Please put your questions in. I will be checking it sporadically, and we'll be weaving those questions through the panel. So I thought we would start, Martin, with yourself, because you've been working very hard on building a taxonomy for this important subject at the European Commission. Tell us the latest developments on that front, just to give us an opening scene-setting sort of context.
Thank you very much, Isabella. Good morning to you all. Well, we started to work on this topic of sustainable finance already 5 years ago, where the Commission presented a very comprehensive plan on how to scale up investments that would be ultimately aligned with our long-term targets. The second objective was to also ensure that the financial sector and companies are resilient to withstand the shocks that we will inevitably see at some point from climate change and environmental degradation. So the two key objectives, reorient capital flows and strengthen resilience, are still today with us. Now, what we did, and maybe just to recall that we have really a huge investment gap here. In order to meet the targets of the Green Deal, of the Repower, or also now most recently the Net Zero Industrial Act, Europe needs, in addition, every year, approximately 700 billion euros every year, in addition to what has been already earmarked. And there is a lot of public money going into these sustainable projects, but it's a fact that the bulk of these investment needs will have to be covered by private funding. And that's exactly why we started to work on a framework, on an enabling framework for the financial sector and companies that would allow this investment gap to be closed and, as I said, also strengthen resilience. There have been three foundations of our work. The first one is taxonomy, and I will say in a minute, what we have done recently. Second building block is transparency and disclosures. We have enforced some rules how the financial sector should be more transparent about what they are selling in terms of sustainable products. Also companies should report on the degree of their sustainability activities or on their impact, and also on the risks, how they are managing these risks. And also the third pillar of our framework has been developing different tools and instruments that the financial sector and the companies can use. You have asked specifically about taxonomy, which has been a project, again, that is very much in the center of our strategy. Taxonomy is essentially a classification system that brings clarity to both investors and companies which economic project, which economic activities are ultimately aligned with the targets. Now, you may argue, why do we need a list of what is already green today, the solar panels and the windmills? Well, the ambition of taxonomy is not only cover activities and projects that are already green today, but in the first place cover projects and sectors which are currently highly polluting, but where the potential to improve the environmental potential is very significant. And that's exactly where the power of taxonomy is. It allows both the financial sector and companies to invest in projects that substantially improve the environmental performance. And that's a tool that the stakeholders have asked us, the Commission, to develop. This is not an idea that I came up with myself. This was something that the financial sector said, we would love to scale up investments, but this is a major obstacle for us because we simply do not understand how good is good enough. Now, where we are, 5 years later, we have already developed climate taxonomy, and just to tell you the power of the climate taxonomy, it covers economic sectors and activities that are responsible for approximately 2/3 of emissions when it comes to climate change mitigation. And 2 weeks ago, the Commission presented a comprehensive package on sustainable finance that also included taxonomy for the other 4 environmental objectives. Sustainability is not only about climate, it's also about environmental objectives. And we have presented a list of economic activities in the area of circular economy, prevention and control of pollution, protection of water and marine resources, and biodiversity. So now the financial sector and the companies will have tools, hopefully useful tool, that will help them to determine which economic projects actually are ultimately aligned. I will already conclude. I just would like to say one thing. Now the Commission has done so much in terms of either regulation or providing these tools. We now need to make sure that everything works on the ground. That was the label of our package presented 2 weeks ago, a sustainable finance framework that works on the ground. So we have listened very carefully to stakeholders who argued, look, we are having this challenge, we are having different questions on how to comply with the disclosure requirements, how to use taxonomy in a dynamic way to support our transition efforts. So the usability and implementation of what we have done will now be the key priority for the Commission for the rest of the mandate, so that we bring impact. And I'm pleased to say that for the first time we are now seeing the first numbers coming from the corporates, and there are some positive, encouraging signals that corporates are using taxonomy to invest into projects, capital expenditure that are aligned with taxonomy. So the recent numbers that we have seen is that companies that are in the index Stocks 600, those who have reported non-zero values, to 25% of the capital expenditures are aligned with taxonomy. So this is a tool that can be used, and we are now going to make sure that it is used as widely as possible. My final point, we have been facing some criticism that this agenda is designed mainly for those who are already green today, and that this agenda is not providing sufficient clarity to those who are facing the most significant challenges, who will ultimately need a little bit more time to transition towards these targets. And we have acknowledged this challenge. And 2 weeks ago, the Commission presented a document, a piece in which we clarify how the existing framework can be helpful for everyone, irrespective of the starting point. And here the premise is that although the targets remain the same for everyone, the pathways and the avenues how to reach these targets can be different, and also the pace can be different. And we are showing a number of practical examples how companies can attract capital for these interim transitional projects, and as well how the financial sector can engineer financing solutions that would provide help and support to those transitioning companies. I will stop here.
So before we get on to the other 2 areas where you're working on, I'd love to hear your response, Lucas, to how this framework is going to impact sort of private investment, because we've heard already that the private sector is going to have to play a big role. So from the perspective of the banks, how do you view the current taxonomy system?
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. So, indeed, banks, we follow closely the European taxonomy because we need to report whether our assets are aligned with the European taxonomy. So, it's something that we follow very closely, indeed. I think the European taxonomy, needless to say, is a very solid framework to measure progress and to provide kind of a sense of direction as to what falls within the green goals alignment. However, the fundamental question I think we should be solving for is when you think about how are we going to decarbonize the economy, right? Think about what that means in real life, right? It means redefining and rebuilding the entire energy system, right? It means rebuilding the entire transport infrastructure, rebuilding the entire production infrastructure. And as Martin was alluding to, that is a huge undertaking that it could very well be in the order of magnitude of 700 billion incremental investment per annum. And a lot of that will entail new technologies, right? So when we think about what should be solving for when we think about decarbonizing Europe is about driving investment and driving innovation, driving those new technologies that are going to allow us to replace the existing fossil fuel molecules and existing highly carbon-intensive industries to cleaner economies. That is what we're trying to solve for. So, and I think a lot of progress is being made. I think the European taxonomy provides a reference framework, but I think it's important to note that the European taxonomy is not a goal in itself. It's a tool towards decarbonizing the economy, right? Some good progress is being made by the European Commission. I think Next Generation EU funds was a huge step in the right direction. Policy framework, huge step. The fact that post-IRA, member states have more autonomy to provide subsidies to green economy, I think is a step in the right direction. But a lot more needs to happen if we want to really drive those investments and reach that 700 billion incremental that Martin was alluding to, right? So I think when you reflect into the way, not to compare, but I think the comparison with the IRA, I think is very obvious every time we talk about the European taxonomy. So in the US, on the IRA that was released in August 2022, the framework was not so much around defining what is green, but rather creating an industrial policy around decarbonization, right? And it was an industrial policy to make sure that value creation and jobs stay in the US and are not outsourced to, primarily Asian countries. Second one, to make sure that those new technologies of the future are going to be retained, that intellectual property, those engineers, that human talent and human capital is going to be retained onshore as opposed to being fully outsourced to other countries. And thirdly, very important to also de-risk supply. You don't want to rely on potentially one day unfriendly partners for all your critical components, whether batteries, solar panels, or heat pumps, right? And the policy, it was very much around an industrial policy that provided a very clear incentive for investment, right? So just to take one example, if you produce clean hydrogen in the US, you will get up to $3 per kilo of hydrogen. It costs about $4.50 per kilo to produce clean hydrogen. The US federal government will pay you up to $3 in the form of a federal tax. That is the one thing that drives investment, and that investment in turn also drives innovation, right? So I think we've developed a number of very powerful and compelling tools. I think now the question is, how do we actually take it on to the next level and attach that taxonomy to an industrial policy to drive investment and innovation? That's the way I would frame it.
So what I'm hearing a little bit, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there may be some concerns about the overly restrictive, more pointed approach that the European Union is taking vis-a-vis America, which is, an easy way to describe it is sort of a stick approach instead of a carrot, more broad brush carrot approach that the US is taking. But Martin, do you see any, limitations in the US approach vis-a-vis the European Union? Like from my perspective, are there risks in the US approach in terms of misdirecting investment into sectors that don't necessarily, have the necessary level of innovation yet, like misdirecting, I don't want to say Ponzi's or frauds, but like if there isn't pointed sort of classification of what is green and what isn't, is there a risk that money gets lost in the system?
Isabella, I just should have clarified that sustainable finance, for which I am responsible in the Commission and that I presented, is only one piece of a puzzle and of different policies that the Commission is pursuing. I mentioned the European Green Deal, I mentioned the Repower, and I also mentioned the Net Zero Industrial Act that the Commission presented earlier this year in spring. And the Commission presented this Net Zero Industrial Act also as a response to what is happening in the United States to ensure that we also have, a clear vision in Europe on how to promote net zero industries and manufacturing of net zero technologies. So, sustainable finance is one element, but of course we have different other policies. I mentioned the Repower EU, for the energy sector, how to reduce dependence on fossil fuels. And then the Net Zero Industrial Act is really trying not only to ensure sufficient access to capital, but also ensure competitiveness of the European business, which is in the heading of this session, and how also we can cut the red tape, how we can reduce the burdens on European companies. It is a fact that in Europe we have more regulation imposed on European companies than anywhere else in the United States. So we need to make sure that that there is a kind of balance, right, at some point, and that we are not, heavily biased only towards, as you said, stick approach. I don't believe that Europe is pursuing a stick approach. I mentioned that our agenda, at least when I come back to the sustainable finance, our agenda on sustainable finance has not been enforcing investors to invest in particular assets and divest from other assets or companies. The approach has been really in terms of disclosure, enforcing disclosures. Now, does it mean that investors cannot still invest in companies that are transitioning? No, they can invest in whatever they want. At the same time, companies now will be subject to disclosure requirements that US companies will not. In Europe, we have pursued this principle of double materiality, which basically in simple language means that companies have to disclose not only the impact of climate change on them, but also the impact of their activities on climate. There is nothing like that in the US approach. We see a big merit in this double materiality. As long as you have an explicit target, you do need to have a disclosure and transparency about the impact of companies. The United States doesn't have that. So we need to be mindful of the competitiveness angle. But we always argue as the European Commission is that sustainability agenda will ultimately improve competitiveness over the medium to long term. And you cannot have a company that will be competitive without actually being, sustainable. So that's, there is an angle that, we see very, very strongly, and we believe that's why the sustainable finance and the net zero, complement each other very well.
So I'm delighted to say I can see your Cookies has joined us, I believe. I hope you can hear us. So we just heard it now. Sustainability is key to competitiveness. But of course, when it comes to Germany, one need only look at the headlines this week. Drop in German business morale points to longer recession. German economy bids goodbye to years of plenty. Germany is facing an ever larger recession than feared, an even larger recession than feared. Germany's economy is facing the perfect storm. And this is the context of where we're coming into this discussion. I thought we'd open up with simply how is Germany positioned vis-a-vis these challenges when it talks about or thinks about competing on sustainability?
Yes, so thank you. A bit over a year ago, we had the big economic debate in Germany, where some economists said that we should stop importing Russian oil, gas, and coal. And they said the economic damage is manageable if we do it, and we would have a recession of -3%. And the whole economic community then told those economists the actual numbers are much, much worse. And if Germany stops importing energy from Russia, the recession will be 5%, 7%, some even estimated 10%. So in that sense, the fact that we are now at a almost zero growth is much, much better than was expected. And I think you just have to understand how deep the shift is that we went through in our economy. 55% of our gas, 40% of our oil, 40% of our coal came from Russia. The price shock was a very, very material adverse terms of trade shock for our economy, which in part is still persisting, given that the energy cost is still higher, despite the fact that it's recovered than pre-crisis levels. So in that sense, I think the fact that we are at close to 0% growth is better than was expected, given the challenge that we're facing with the complete rejigging of our energy import structure. Of course, we can never be happy at even a slight recession, and we're not. And I would say the recent decisions by some very large companies to locate in Germany and to increase their investment in Germany shows that the attractiveness of our country to foreign direct investment is still very strong. We've taken very resolute measures on the energy price front. We are very, very committed to our build out of renewable capacity. We currently have one auction of offshore wind that will immediately double the volume of offshore wind production from 7.8 gigawatts by another 7 gigawatts. The companies that are bidding for that have submitted, 4 of them have submitted so-called zero bids, i.e. bids that require zero subsidies. So the build out of our renewable sector and therefore lower energy prices is alive and kicking and is really happening in industrial scale. And that will trigger a huge amount of additional investments. And if you look at what's going on in the semiconductor space, I mean, there was a lot of news around Intel last week, obviously, but that's just a part of our strategy. We announced last year the joint venture between Wolfspeed and ZF Friedrichshafen to build one of the most modern chip design and manufacturing plants, fabs for the automotive industry in the Saar region. Infineon announced a 5 billion investment in Dresden to build additional capacity, and now with Intel, we've just announced the biggest foreign direct investment in our history with over 30 billion going into leading edge ultra high technology chip production in Germany. So you add to that recent investments like the 12 billion investment of Global Carrier into one of our Mittelstand companies in the alternative heat pump industry. That just shows that that there is a lot of capital also flowing into Germany, while the press is, I think, more writing about the attractiveness of the IRA, which no doubt exists. But I would like to say that there are quite a lot of pieces of evidence to the contrary that that Germany as an investment destination is attracting more than double-digit billions at this time.
Lucas, from the perspective of the banks, how would you sort of, how would you assess that statement? Is Germany an attractive place for private sector investment in the current system of framework, taxonomy framework, all the kind of Russian sanctions, etc.? Does that resonate with you, what you're hearing?
Well, listen, I think I think Cookies explained it really well. What's going on in the German economy, right? It's not easy to kind of almost overnight switch from a Russian dependence on cheap gas and coal and kind of redefine and reestablish the whole energy system. So it's worth noting all the industries that your Cookies just mentioned are highly energy intensive, right? So, the German industry, the petrochemical industry, the chips manufacturing, the semiconductors manufacturing is an incredibly energy intensive industry. So the fact that we're seeing those FDIs and investment flows into Germany in this context, I think, it speaks to the resilience of the German economy. I think, as we were discussing earlier, the Net Zero Industrial Act that has provided the member states more leeway and more flexibility to support in the form of subsidies and non-dilutive capital some very key, unique investments. I think is a tool that is being used by all the different member states. Germany is committed to do that and to continue kind of rebuilding the German economy that we're going to be needing in the future, right? I think from a bank perspective, I don't think we can have a thriving economy in Europe if Germany doesn't play its part because of how the role it plays in the GDP and the industry. I think what we're seeing with all this Net Zero Industrial Act and the greenifying and decarbonization on the industry is we're going to see much more manufacturing taking place in Europe globally, right? And this is not just Germany, it applies to France, where Macron has made its whole kind of political plan around the reindustrialization of France, but we're seeing that in Italy, in countries like Spain as well. So I think the whole decarbonization and greenifying of the economy is a huge opportunity to reindustrialize Europe. And obviously, Germany will play its part, but I think it's an opportunity that is much broader than just Germany.
And the banks are going to be there supporting this investment from the private sector side?
So this is always the question, right? So, are the banks going to be providing capital? First, listen, coming back to the earlier point, right? The energy transition is going to be extremely onerous. This is going to be, if we really want to strike a chance at decarbonizing the economy, we're going to need an unprecedented amount of capital. This is going to be huge. Again, going back to the point of 700 billion euros per annum incremental to the investment rate that we're experiencing today, that is a huge amount of capital to be deployed. Now, I think banks will play its role, and I'm going to come to that in a minute. I'm not going to be ducking the question.
Be conscious that we only have 7 minutes.
Sure. But I think it's important to note that we're going to need to tap on different sources of capital. It's not just the bank financing. So I'm going to give you an example. In Europe, European corporates depend on 70% of their funding sources from banks. Compare that to the US, and that number is 30%. That means that US companies, they have other pockets and sources of capital like debt funds, growth capital funds, venture capital, private equity funds, that they can, capital markets, they can issue bonds, right, at a much greater scale than we can in Europe. So we need to build an entire capital markets infrastructure and to avoid relying too much on banks. Now, when it comes to banks, and again, I'm not ducking the question, what I'd say is banks are committed to play its part in the energy transition. I don't think there is any large bank that has not established decarbonization or sustainable finance as one of their key strategic pillars. So I think we've been very explicit at saying we're committed to this energy transition and we're gonna be part of this. Now, the great news is that European banks are highly capitalized, as we've seen in recent months. However, we play under some structural weaknesses that I think is worth noting, right? So, think about the fact that since the global financial crisis, 15 years after the global financial crisis, European banks are still not earning its cost of capital, right? And it's been 15 years since the global financial crisis. And where is that structural difference, weakness coming from? I think there are two fronts. One is the capital markets again. So the European banking model relies too much on sourcing risk, creating loans and retaining those loans in our own balance sheet. Why? Because we don't have the tools, notably the securitization tools, to divest and to rotate that capital. Mm-hmm. And I know I need to press, but the second one is scale. Still, the European banking market is extremely fragmented. So we need to, I guess I'll conclude here, but we need to further deepen into our capital markets union and to ensure that the European banks and financial system have the relevant scale and concentration.
So banks are a little bit hard up, is what I'm hearing. But very quickly, I've got a few questions. One very quickly for you, Martin, and it's from Benjamin Kearney. Why the European reporting standards, why have they not been aligned with the already present green taxonomy standards?
Well, first of all, the taxonomy reporting is about activities that companies have that substantially contribute to meeting one of the 6 environmental objectives. So it's a specific project that allows investors and companies to identify projects that substantially contribute. Now, the reporting standards that we are currently finalizing, there is a public consultation that has a deadline in 2 weeks' time, is covering, again, KPIs, key performance indicators, that companies will have to report on both how they manage risks stemming from climate change and environmental degradation, but also about the impact of their activities on climate and environment, irrespective how good or positive the impact is. So the scope of disclosures under the corporate reporting standard, under the so-called European Sustainability Reporting Standard, is much broader. Under the taxonomy, companies are supposed to basically report only 2 indicators: the proportion of revenues that are aligned with taxonomy and proportion of capital expenditure that are aligned with taxonomy. Under the corporate reporting standards, there is a plethora of different indicators that cover sustainability performance of companies at large. So there is a difference here, and there is actually a perfect alignment there, because taxonomy focuses on one thing, and the corporate reporting standards that we are going to finalize focuses on some other things. I hope it's clear.
Thank you so much. I mean, we could go on forever, but I want to give the last word to Mr. Cookies. So first of all, I would love to hear, I want to give you a right of reply in terms of what you've heard here on the panel, but also I want to shift gears a little bit, and there's a question from the audience regarding EU fiscal rules, the reform of. Is the German request for a minimum annual debt reduction a red line without which no deal is possible?
Many thanks. I really liked what I heard from Lucas. Obviously, I think he was spot on with the points on the challenges facing our economy, and I think we're really confronting them and tackling them. I mean, just to give you a number, also, we just recently had a report, an analysis saying that in the next 7 years, the capital required only in the energy sector, in terms of investments for our greening of the economy, is 600 billion in the next 7 years. So that is a sizable, very big investment. 125 billion of that will be into our electricity grids, the rest in power generation, hydrogen grids, etc. And then you talk about a huge number of additional volumes of capex that will be done within the corporate sector to achieve lower energy costs combined with climate neutrality. So I'm very optimistic on the implication of that, because it, of course, on the one side, it replaces one capital stock with another one. But I think the key point is the energy produced and from that new capital stock of renewables will be much cheaper than the previous fossil one in all aspects of the story, both in terms of the raw price. We're calculating, if we look at the power purchase agreements being struck with an electricity price in the single digits, which is very sizably below the current market level, which at the margin is being determined and priced off the fossil curve. So that is a cost benefit to our economy in the medium and long term. As to the SGP, I mean, we're in negotiations, and I don't want to artificially draw any red lines or make anything anticipate anything of the discussions which are going to be held among the finance ministers. I would say the point of sustainability and systematic debt reduction is a very important part of our negotiating position. The fact that we are calling for an ex-ante commitment to reduce the level of debt is an extremely important part of the negotiating package. We've said very many times that we need this common anchor and this common denominator. If we bilateralize all fiscal relationships, in our view, it would be a weakening of the fiscal union, not a strengthening.
And in the 20 seconds that we have left, is the Commission's plan to leverage Russian foreign reserves for Ukraine an overshoot? A question from the audience. For Mr. Cookies.
I mean, we're carefully evaluating that. It's a very, very complicated question because it touches on a lot of legal issues that are delicate and complicated. So we're still in the phase of analyzing the Commission's proposal.
On that note, thank you very much, everybody, for joining me. There's going to be a little break, networking break now, but please be back here for 11:40. Thank you very much, everybody.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.